Hi everybody, I'm Mike, and this is Mike Tries Motorsports, the only show on YouTube with its own secret police force. On today's episode, we're going to do a little bit of prep work to the Audi, and then we're going to take it to its first road course event for a good old-fashioned shakedown. Here's Garage Studio Mike for the introduction to the work that we're doing on the car today. Tonight, we're bleeding the brakes on We're bleeding the brakes on the A4. We're going to be taking it to the track tomorrow. And we want to make sure we have optimum performance, particularly from the braking system. Brake fluid absorbs water from the atmosphere naturally. Even though you'll have your cap on your reservoir and everything's closed up and sealed, moisture still gets in. And water has a lower boiling point than brake fluid. So when you're getting your brakes really hot, that heat is transferred everywhere. It's transferred into the wheels, into the tires, into the brake pistons, and into the brake fluid. And when that fluid gets really hot, well, the water inside of it boils and turns to steam. The rest of the brake fluid doesn't do this, but now you have bubbles in your system. So when you press on your brake pedal, you have a spongy brake pedal. That's not ideal for stopping when you're going 120 miles per hour and you're dragging as much weight as this thing weighs around a racetrack with you. So in order to prevent those surprise episodes, I like to flush out completely as much of the brake fluid as possible. I'm doing a lot of time-lapse filming here tonight just to speed up the process because it's kind of late and I need to wake up really early in the morning. But I did want to capture as much of this as I possibly could. Typically when you do this, you start with the wheel that is farthest from the master cylinder. Actually, you start by draining the master cylinder of all the old fluid and filling it with fresh fluid. That way you don't have to suck all the old fluid through the whole system. But then, yeah, you do start at the farthest and you work your way closest to the master cylinder. The master cylinder is on the driver's side of the car at the front. So naturally, we'll start at the passenger side rear, then move to the driver's side rear, then this front wheel here, and then the driver's side front. By the time we do all of that, we should have pulled all of the old fluid through the system, and we should be left with nice, fresh fluid. The other thing I'd like to do today is install this sensor here. This is an ABS sensor for the driver's side front wheel. Looks a little bit like this. It's a Hall effect sensor. And this measures wheel speed at all four corners. But the speedometer in the car requires this sensor to be functional on the driver's side front tire. Without a functional sensor, the speedometer will give me no reading, zero reading, and I'll have ABS warning lights. I'd like for the ABS system to function perfectly tomorrow because it's great to use ABS if you have it when you're at a racetrack, but if you don't have it, well, you just have to manage with a little bit more of a judicious application of the brakes. So I'm going to continue on doing this. I'll put you back in that time lapse so it appears to go by pretty quickly. And maybe we'll play some music in the background as well. So I hope you enjoy it. This will just be part of that episode probably where we're at the track. So at some point you might see some Friday at the track excitement down at Summit Point Raceway. Thanks for the introduction, Garage Mike. Here you can see that I'm starting in the engine bay of the car. My first objective is to remove this cover to gain access to the brake master cylinder reservoir so that I can drain it and then fill it with fresh fluid. As I said in the introduction, it's best to start here so you're not trying to drain the whole brake master cylinder reservoir through the passenger side brake caliper in the rear. The fluid reservoir has a nipple on it so that I can attach a vacuum pump to it in order to make draining it much easier. I had to improvise a bit since I don't have a vacuum pump. I ended up using a siphon and some gaff tape to make a pump, and it actually worked out really well. Here you can see me removing the center caps and the rear wheel. The siphon pump will become visible as well. I used it to draw a vacuum on the little sealed cup to pull fluid from the calipers. This worked better than I thought it would have, actually. Given more time to prepare, I would have bought a tool designed for this. Something important to note, I've noticed that brake fluid is pretty gnarly stuff, It can dissolve paint and seals, including those seals inside your vacuum pump if you're not careful. Try not to get it in your pump. You may also note that I don't replace the wheel's center caps. I leave these off for the time being so that I can retorque my lug nuts periodically. You should always check lug nut torque between every session at whatever kind of event you go to. Oh, and something for the discussion down below here. If they're bolts, are they still called lug nuts? Anyway, we can discuss that. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of time to capture all of the details from the garage on camera. Here are some important things to look out for while you're preparing your own braking system for track day of use. First, bleed or flush your brakes by working from the wheel farthest from the master cylinder toward the closest wheel. You can see that I start off doing just that. Second, if you have multi-piston calipers, you may have two bleed screws on the calipers, one on the inner face and one on the outer face. Pay attention to this and be sure to bleed from both of them. Third, take an opportunity to measure brake pad thickness and rotor thickness while you're in there. I'm told that it's not a lot of fun to burn through your brake pads while you're going 140 miles per hour, and that brake pads without any friction material just don't work that well. Something to remember and to consider here is that your brakes are designed to convert kinetic energy, energy of movement, into thermal energy, heat. So the thicker the pad material, the better the ability for the brake pads to absorb heat, and your brake pads actually act as an insulator between your braking surface, the surface between the rotor and the brake pads, and the piston and fluid inside the brake caliper. So the thicker your brake pads are, the better the insulating properties are, and the less likely you are to have fluid boil-induced brake fade. Use a good brake fluid, and make sure you get one that's compatible with your system. For instance, .5 brake fluid is completely incompatible with .3 and .4 systems, and mixing the fluids can actually cause some serious problems. I believe it might also be corrosive to some of your braking components if your brake system wasn't designed to work with .5 fluid. You're going to want to find a fluid with a high boiling point. You're given two numbers generally with brake fluids, the dry boiling point and the wet boiling point. Dry is always higher than wet. And what do we mean by wet boiling point? Well, brake fluid absorbs moisture, absorbs water from the air. And as we all know, water boils at 212 degrees. So if your brake fluid is good for up to 400 or 500 degrees, and it's saturated with water, well, that water will start to boil off, and it will start to create pockets of gas. Gas is compressible. That's bad. You should not go crazy with upgrades before your first track day. But if there's one thing you do change, I would recommend that it be the brake pads. If you have a car like a BMW or a Porsche or something with a similar track pedigree, this may not be necessary. But if you're about to hit the track for the first time in an old Audi, an older Mazda Miata, or something really heavy and fast like a Mustang GT or an Nissan 350Z without the performance brake pad, without the performance brake systems, I would definitely recommend that you consider looking into a set of performance brake pads. Why? Good question. Well, your brake pads are made of a variety of materials, but you might have two basic components in them, binders and friction material. Your friction material can be non-metallic, semi-metallic, ceramic, or even just sintered steel. All of these materials have their thermal limits, though, and if you exceed those limits, some of the materials in the pad may start to evaporate, causing a gas layer to form between the surface of the rotor and the surface of the brake pad, essentially lubricating it. Or the pads could even catch on fire. We actually think the brakes were on fire in this 350Z after it took over 1,000 feet to stop the car once brake fade set in. In the beginning, I would probably look for a pad that's marketed for dual use. If you're doing autocross, look for a pad that's marketed for street and autocross use. Ditto for street and track day use. This might not be enough for your application, though, so you'll need to do a little research before your first event, particularly before a track day. The only thing I would really recommend against is going with a track-only pad. These do not work well until they have a great deal of heat in them, and they're just not suitable for street use because of that. They might work on the street, but their performance when cold may be unpredictable and dangerous, and they can even wear your rotors prematurely. Okay, so what did we learn about the car from the track day? Well, first, I think the car did pretty well overall. The tires they were new and they provided some grip, but they were ill-suited to this kind of abuse as they were already starting to chunk apart a bit around the shoulders. That might have been because of the autocross, though. I believe that autocross is a little bit harder on tires than road course work. They provided plenty of grip for me, though, so I was happy overall. I think they'll do just fine for the remainder of the season. The suspension was actually surprisingly good. I suspect it's been lowered, and usually I worry about lowering kits being more for show than go. But this one, whatever was installed here, seemed like it was up to the task. I'll need more data, I'll need more laps to know for sure whether this is an acceptable kit. I just didn't have enough time on it, but I didn't have any of the issues that I would typically expect to find with a lowered car. What are those concerns? Well, a lot of times cars that have lowered suspension will bind, the suspension will bind through corners, meaning the suspension compresses and then you're on the bump stop, and then your spring rate goes to infinity, and the next bump you hit sends the car out of control. That's a real problem, and I've known people to crash cars because of this. Another issue that we could have is a tire coming up and rubbing on the inside of the sheet metal of the fender or on the fender liner. I've seen that as well. I don't think it's as serious as an issue, but if you do experience something like that, your best bet is to head into the pits, see if there's something you can do about it at the track, and if not, take the car home and see if you can address it in the garage. If you're rubbing your tire against the inside of your wheel well or your fender, you could cut the tire or do damage to the wheel well. Plus, you could have another instance where your tire would bump up against something on the inside of your wheel well and again send your spring rate through the roof. So you really want your suspension to be able to work for you as you go through corners. The engine was sprightly and fun. The turbo lag that hampered the performance of the car during the autocross event simply wasn't present during this event because I was able to keep the RPMs much higher. More horsepower certainly would have been fun, but the car certainly doesn't need it. It might be fun to put on a performance tune on the car. These can be easily had for a few $100s and can greatly benefit the performance of the car. But I'll have to look into the legality of leaving it on there before I make it permanent if I'm going to bring the car into certain SCCA classes. Honestly, the thing that needs to improve the most is me. I could tell after just a couple laps that I was starting to find my groove again, but it's been a number of years since I've been on a racetrack, and that was showing, that was evident to me. So the dust needs to come off. Okay, now, the brakes need to improve. The brakes need to improve right away. I have to do something about them. I got 3 laps at this event before the brakes, I think, were literally on fire. If they weren't on fire, they were at least outgassing and the pads were done. Anyone considering a big brake kit as a performance upgrade, you might be surprised to find out that the bigger rotors aren't necessarily the solution to all of your braking woes. It's probably the brake pads. And I think that the brake pads that I have in this car, well, they were ill-suited to the task at hand. I had my dad and my daughter with me that day, so I decided that I had enough. I didn't think that a second session would be worth the risk, though, in talking to a friend later, perhaps a second session would have yielded some different results if the organic compounds had burned off in the first session. Sometimes there's a break-in procedure called bedding in for getting your brake pads and your rotors ready for use, and sometimes this involves burning off some of the organic compounds that are in the pads themselves. Still, we all came down in this car together, and I didn't feel that it would be right to take the excess risk. it feels much better at the end of the day when you're standing next to your intact car, explaining to some of your friends why you're giving up early, instead of explaining to your friends why your wheel is missing and why your car's all dented up. So, lesson learned. I'm probably going to pick up a set of EBC yellow stuff pads for the car. I'll put them on both axles and I'll see how it does. Yellow stuff pads operate well over a very broad temperature band, over a wide temperature band, and this makes them suitable for both street use and they should be able to hold up to the track as well. Hawk DTC 30s are another favorite of mine, but unfortunately they just don't seem to make them in a size that fits my calipers, which, by the way, are apparently Porsche Boxster derived calipers, in case you're wondering. I think I may have incorrectly called them 6-piston calipers in another video that I did, or it actually may be the next video you watch, but they are actually 4-piston calipers and they are from a Porsche Boxster. So in the next episode, we're going to take a look at some of the aftermath of what we went through for the day. Mostly we're going to be looking at the brakes. Brake pad change is a must. I've actually looked at the rotors, and the inner surface of the rotors actually looks pretty bad. It looks like they might have been machined or worn down significantly. The slots are essentially gone, and on the inner and outer edges, the inner and outer faces of the rotors, the slots are worn badly. They're filled with debris, and the holes that are drilled, and this is the most concerning part to me, they don't look like they're in great shape. And I've heard of some real bad stories where drilled rotors can crack. Drilling a hole through the material actually stresses it, and if that's not managed well, cracks can form there, propagate, and cause your rotor to explode. That's bad. So we're going to take a look at all of that stuff in the next episode. We might also look at possible replacements for the rotors. I'm trying to source perhaps a custom bracket for the car so that I can move the calipers into a position that would allow them to work with a smaller rotor, a more ubiquitous rotor that I can find almost anywhere instead of just that one rotor from that one company. Until then, thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you're interested in what we're doing here. I'm Mike. This has been Mike Tries Motorsports. Keep it shiny side up, and I'll see you in the next one.